So recently I got a comment on my short which was about the USS Kelvin and more specifically how J.J. Abrams tampers with scaling. And I got a comment from someone called D.S. Wayne, and his response was that no one tricked me about starship scaling. Why? Because it's all fiction. Models are only representations. Star Trek has always been about story. As William Shatner once said, the USS Enterprise merely serves as a vehicle for the show, not the show itself. This whole debate about scaling is what gives science fiction fans a bad name. I'm going to respectfully disagree with that statement. Now, that statement by William Shatner is actually quite a Star Wars-y view of starships and the role that they play within a story. In Star Wars, ships are most often considered, yes, vehicles for stories. They exist to take characters from point A to point B and get them out again. That's why hyperspace is so critical to the way storytelling works in Star Wars. That particular universe mechanic plays an important part in Star Wars stories. It's why they can end in the way they do. But I'm not here to talk about hyperspace versus warp drive as a storytelling method. What I'm here to talk about is scale. But aside from the whole in-universe importance of scale in terms of creating a universe that is believable, scale is extremely important for storytelling. So let's look at a Star Wars example first and foremost. We're going to look at the only convincing romance in the Star Wars movies, the romance between Han and Leia. Where does that take place? Or where does it begin to bloom? The Millennium Falcon. Right. The size of the Millennium Falcon is very, very important to that romance. You see, you think about it, in the sort of introduction of the film, we're introduced to the rebels and their base on Hoth. It's a relatively large base, so there is clearly an ability for Han and Leia to avoid each other, to avoid confronting their feelings for each other, that tension that exists. They're constantly trying to, just escape from one another or ignore one another. And because they're in this relatively large ice base, they can do it. Now, once they're on the Millennium Falcon, and, there's also that whole romantic trope of she's trusting him with her life. This no-good scoundrel smuggler, she's got to trust him now. This princess, I mean, it's what trashy romance novels are made of. And, what do you know? They're in a relatively small ship. Not too small. Not small where it gets to, to quote Dennis from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, because of the implication. It's small enough where, they have to deal with each other. They can still take space and get away from each other if they want to. But there's just enough space that means that they have to deal with each other, and eventually their feelings for each other have to come to the surface. Now that is completely born out of the fact that the Millennium Falcon is a small ship. If they were on a large star cruiser or something like that, it would make that kind of storytelling very difficult. Because it would make the romance play out far differently. Chances are one would actually have to actively pursue the other. The Millennium Falcon, actually, it's acting as a bit of a character in and of itself, because it's forcing these two people together, and that's what makes it such an effective and endearing romance story. Han isn't being some creep chasing her around a star cruiser, or indeed she's not being some thirsty yandere chasing him around the place. So it works because of the scale of the ship. Now let's take that over to Star Trek. We've seen a lot of different size of ship in Star Trek over the years, and those all inform different tones. Original series Star Trek, the Enterprise is good size, but still quite confined. And there's also a real expectation of a professional decorum. More specifically with original series, I'll talk about the tension between with Yeoman Rand and Captain Kirk, right? So again, relatively confined ship. Everyone knows everyone on the original Enterprise. It's all relatively confined. And in Balance of Terror, so Kirk, when the Enterprise shuts down, Kirk goes and stays in his quarters. And it's just interesting that it's Yeoman Rand that comes in, and she presumes to come in. She doesn't knock, she just comes in and says, "Is there anything I can get you, Captain?" And you can just tell there's that little bit of, You know, there's that little tension there, and, you know, they've almost got enough space where they can kind of ignore it, but not completely. It's always there. They can't actively avoid each other, but they've got enough space that they don't have to confront their feelings, or indeed that they have to maintain that professional decorum, because, you know, I mean, that's what brilliant romance are made of. You know, the point is that the characters, they try to reject their feelings. That's what makes it so enjoyable for us to watch. You know, that's why, you know, Princess Leia, oh no, he's a scoundrel, and Han's like, yeah, she's a stuck-up princess, and it's like, yeah, but, you know, we the audience, like, yeah, you're not seeing what we're seeing, and we know as the audience what's happening there. And that's something that is borne out by scale. You think about on the Enterprise D. Well, on the Enterprise D, the ship is huge. It's colossal. If you don't like someone on the Enterprise D, you don't ever have to see them. And if you want to avoid someone, you can avoid them. You know, if Keiko does not want to see O'Brien, she didn't have to. She didn't have to, but, you know, Data's got to be Data and sort of be oblivious to social dynamics in order to make things happen. Because there's so much space on the Enterprise D that people can kind of, you know, keep away from each other and not have to deal with any issues and tensions that may exist between them. Really, this comes down to why we like this content, right? You know, are we nerding out about, you know, fictional space, you know, sci-fi vehicles and equipment? Yes, we are. But what we're also doing whenever I think we're talking about this is whenever I talk about a new ship, I think you guys are always thinking about the kind of adventures that are being had on these ships. Who are the people who are going to be crewing them? What are they like? What were their lives like? What kind of society, you know, did they grow up in? What's their kind of, you know, how professional or relaxed are they? When you have a ship of a certain size, you create various storytelling opportunities. So you think about the Enterprise D, you've got the holodeck, you've got gymnasiums, you've got 10 forward, you've got all these places in which you can have your dialogue, which is important because dialogue does not just happen in a vacuum. You know, there's always, you know, people have to be doing something. Now, there's a real big difference with, say, the Enterprise D, where there's an awful lot of what we'll call play areas. These are relaxed areas. These are, you know, and that contributes to the fairly relaxed tone of Next Generation. You compare that to something like the Defiant in Deep Space Nine, and there's no play areas in the Defiant. Everything is functional in that ship. You've got the closest thing to a play space is the ship's mess, and, you know, that's literally you're going to get in, have your chow, get out. And so it brings a very different feel to character interactions, because it always will mean that characters are going to be interacting while on duty and doing important technical things. When we look at these ships and when we consider how big they are or aren't, why is the size of the Kelvin important? Well, because we have to ask ourselves, how was James T. Kirk made? Was the Kelvin a big ship, right? You know, was it a big ship, and was the romance quite a slow burn, relaxed affair? Was there enough space for George Kirk and Kirk's mother to sort of slowly move together? Or was it a smaller ship? Was it more confined? Was it perhaps a little bit more, you know, charged and filled with passion and drama? And they're trying to resist their feelings for one another, but the ship's so small they can't get away from each other. They're seeing each other every day. They just can't, you know. That's important for storytelling. The scale of the ship is important for how that relationship develops. And thus, considering also, you know, subsequent to that, you know, well, how were they as a couple? How were they when they were on Earth, when they were raising Jim Kirk? You know, all these kind of things. I mean, there's really endless ways you can talk about how scale affects storytelling. You think about how when they do their Klingon episodes, and they basically have a handful of sets available because, you know, it's a ship of the week. And again, that means that there's a need to confront problems, and the characters have to confront problems. They can't have other people sort of act as go-betweens, which I think often happens actually in Next Generation. On the Enterprise D, there's space to hide. Of course, there's the holodecks. You know, that's what makes a character like Barclay so possible. Do you think Barclay would have been able to survive in 23rd century Starfleet? I don't think he would have been able to survive, because the confines would have been so tight, and everyone's eyes would have been on him all the time. There would be no space for him to escape away to the holodeck or wherever else you could escape to on a larger ship of the 24th century. There just wouldn't be that provision for him. So he probably wouldn't be able to survive in 23rd century Starfleet. And again, that sort of informs how characterization works. Why is everyone so relaxed on the Enterprise D? Well, because it's a more kind of free, open space, as opposed to 23rd century Enterprise, where everything's very confined and everyone's got to sort of, as I say, maintain that professional decorum. You can't be going around fraternizing with each other. Just a final note on, spaces that can be various size. Let's contrast a dinner with Captain Archer to a dinner with Captain Pike in Strange New Worlds. Strange New Worlds, they scaled up the Enterprise. Now, if that was just for the purposes of CG, I'd kind of almost forgive it, but it doesn't. It actually scales up the interiors as well. Again, if those scaled up interiors were just bigger machinery, would be fine. But they don't. Captain Pike has a bachelor pad, a literal bachelor pad, and it's enough that it's big enough that he can invite the entire bridge crew, come along and have breakfast with him. And, everyone's hanging around and it's all fun and casual and everything. But there's not much focus because it's the entire cast. You compare that to in Star Trek Enterprise, when Captain Archer, as was his custom, invites members of his crew to breakfast with him. And he's literally just got a little cupboard adjacent to the main mess hall. It's tiny. It can, at max, sit about 4 people. Comfortably 2, 3, just about 4, you're really pushing it. But what that means is that you have this very different atmosphere. It's a much more intimate atmosphere, but it's also much more confined. It's almost a little bit uncomfortable, because it's like you've been summoned to the headmaster's office. Malcolm Reed is visibly uncomfortable. It's not that Malcolm Reed is completely terrified of Archer in and of himself. He's perfectly happy to speak to Archer in a professional setting when there's other people around. But suddenly put in that sort of one-on-one interaction and asked to drop the rank, and he doesn't know what to do. And, and that's all born out of the location. That's all born out of the scale of the ship. As much as I sort of protest at the Enterprise having a relatively limited crew in Star Trek Enterprise, what that does mean is that it would be a realistic prospect for Archer to get through and have breakfast with every single member of his crew, which is, that's a very key part of his character and his growth. And that's just not something that is viable on, say, a bigger ship like the Enterprise D, where you've got at least 1,000 people on there. Let alone when we talk about bigger ships like the Odyssey class, where, things are even bigger. I mean, that's a much, much, much more impersonal environment, and it's not likely that everyone knows everyone. It's less of a sort of a small confined office space. So you almost want to compare it to, Star Trek Enterprise is set in an office, TOS is set in, say, 3 offices, and by the time you get to Next Generation, and then if you were to do a ship on an Odyssey class ship, you'd be looking at something like a block of offices, if not a whole estate of offices. And that breeds very different social dynamics. The people who are going to, they're sharing a common space-ish, and they're going to meet each other and chat and everything, but then they're going to go off and do their separate things. They're not, stuck working with each other for long periods of time, and that produces different social dynamics. With that all said and done, that is why starship scaling is important. Also, one final note. Some of you might be aware of the fan series Theurgy, which is, I must insist, definitely not a smut series. They say it on their website. They are not a smut series. Look it up at your own peril. But, they like to have romances, and they're set on a big Odyssey-sized ship, right? Big Odyssey-sized ship with gymnasiums and starship troopers, co-ed showers, and all that good stuff. Personally, you know, if you're going to write a romance or erotic stories or whatever, I'd set it on an archer class, because that's what trashy romances are made of. So, thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed this rant, and I will see you all in the next video.